one. This is the one we have the most of, so most common for the lab practical.
Cool.
So this whole outside part of the brain with these ups and downs is the cerebrum or the cerebral hemispheres, right? And we know that the parts that are kind of out, rounded out, bumped out, we call those gyri, and where it dips down in, where the tissue has dipped in, but it's still all gray matter, but they're called sulci, right? On the other hand, between the two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, there's a huge opening. There's almost really nothing connecting them together. That we're going to call a fissure. And this one we're going to call the longitudinal fissure. And then back here, where the cerebellum has decided to fall off, if you just look at this, the cerebellum kind of hangs out from under the cerebral cortex, and so this whole area would be called the transverse fissure, all right? Again, a big opening versus these just ups and downs. All right. All right. So then, all right. So then on the brain, we have these series of gyri and sulci. There's always one that goes all the way from the midline all the way out down to actually where the temporal lobe is, and that one's constant as far as I know in all people, and that's called the central sulcus.
This one?
Nope. This one.
This one.
Jeez,
This
you're
one.
messing up my video.
Sorry.
Right. So this one, so number 5 in this little picture right here, that's the central sulcus. In front of it is going to be the precentral gyrus. Behind it is the postcentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is primary motor cortex, and the postcentral gyrus is primary somatosensory cortex, meaning skin, touch, right? We have the various lobes of the brain, the frontal lobe, which of course is named because it's under the frontal bone. We have the temporal lobe, here off to the side, under the temporal bone. The back lobe is the occipital lobe, and then this major portion sort of all here is the parietal lobe, again, under the parietal lobe of the brain. And then, as I've told you, there's another lobe where you know from reading called the insula, which you can't see from surface inspection. You have to pull the temporal lobe away, but you can tell it's still cortex because it has these ridges and sulci, okay? So that's the insula, insulated, insular. Think of some words that might mean something. All right. So if I split now the brain in half, okay, this model doesn't very well show you. I mean, you know, the very outside layer of the cerebral hemisphere, maybe 2 millimeters thick, is gray matter, and pretty much everything else under that is white matter or axons. But there are a couple important sets of groups of axons that we are interested in. This one is called the corpus callosum, and these are all the axons going between the two cerebral hemispheres, okay? And then there is another fiber bundle that you can find pretty much just under the corpus callosum, leading down to the bottom of the brain, to the hypothalamus area. Actually, that's called the fornix. And one of the things that you can realize from this picture is this area between the corpus callosum and the fornix, this is the part of the lateral ventricle. You may remember that there's a membrane kind of here, and that's called the septum pellucidum. So I'm going to go down then farther. Okay. So cerebral nuclei, which really should be the basal nuclei or basal ganglia, we would have to find those inside. Well, I can do that. So if I pull the temporal lobe off, first of all, you find the insula, right? But then if I pull that out, then what's inside of that is these basal nuclei, right? So the highest part of this sort of subcortical area is the basal nuclei. But again, there's also the insula here, so basal nuclei. Let's switch to the, doesn't really matter. All right. So here I've actually switched to the other side now. Once again, you've got the corpus callosum. Once again, you've got the fornix. Here you've got lateral ventricle, and there's the septum pellucidum here. Come down a little farther, and one thing you can see on all these is there'll be a little bump or a little knob or something. This is called the intermediate mass or massa intermedia, which is actually a connection between the thalamus on each side of the brain, and that actually will cut through the third ventricle. So this whole depression here is the third ventricle. This area here, sort of football shaped if you were able to see it well, is the thalamus. Going a little forward from the thalamus and down, you hit the hypothalamus. And a couple things you can tell about the hypothalamus. One, you have this stalk sticking out, the infundibulum, that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And you also have on each side this fairly large bump out of the hypothalamus that's called the mammillary body, or both of them mammillary bodies. All right. Then if you go back from the thalamus and you run into a little piece of tissue here, and this is the epithalamus, which ends in the pineal gland, which is also known as the third eye, and we know releases melatonin and is important for this circadian rhythm. All right. Going down, so these three structures, the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus make up the diencephalon. If we then now go sort of farther down in the brain, heading towards the spinal cord, first thing that we can run into are these two bumps on each side, which is the superior and inferior colliculus. Together they make the quadragenema, and this is part of the midbrain. All right. If we then look from the other side, we will see these fibers running north and south, all right, running up to cortex and away from cortex. That's the cerebral peduncles, and they're covering over the midbrain, which has a couple other structures in it, but you can't see in these models, but the substantia nigra and the red nucleus. So if we come down now from, and of course here now we can see this cerebral aqueduct coming down into our fourth ventricle. That's this kind of opening here. We come down a bit farther, and one thing we run into is this other really large white matter tract, and in the models you can kind of tell that because it's lines across, but these are going across. This is the cerebellar peduncles, so they're going to bring information in and out of the cerebellum, and they're covering over the pons, all right, which is another part of the brain stem. So we had the midbrain, now we have the pons, which includes the cerebellar peduncles, and then as we go farther back, we hit the medulla oblongata, and then we would be into the spinal cord, all right? If I can, let's see, let me pull the temporal lobe off. You know this is the olfactory tract, the olfactory bulb. You should know that this is part of the optic nerve, then the optic chiasm here in the middle, and then the optic tracts, which go into here. Again, this is the pituitary, the mammillary body. And then if we look more at the brainstem itself. We would then go down along the cerebellar peduncles, we would find this very large cranial nerve. That's going to be cranial nerve 5, which is the trigeminal. You'll come back from that and you'll find 7 and 8, which is the vestibulocochlear.
Which one's 7
nerve.
and which one's 8?
This one is 7, that one's 8. On different models, they may make 8 look farther back than 7, okay? But they're basically together, okay? And then if you move medially, then you'll run into cranial nerve 6, okay? And then I don't think you'll have to know so much where the other ones are, but they kind of go in order. So if you find 7 and 8, then the next little thing sticking out should be 9, and then 10, and then you get 11, and then you actually have 12 up here, okay? So you can kind of follow them in order. It's hard to find 3 and 4 on a lot of the models, so I think the big one is the trigeminal, olfactory, optic, and then to be able to find 7 and 8 and 6, okay? All right.
Cerebellum.
Cerebellum. So cerebellum, the little brain.
You might need the other half of this.
See what I got to put back together to be able to do this. I got to have more.
Lego.
What am I doing?
Ew, I sound so stupid
mind.
on video.
Great. Okay.
It's not just some videoing.
So, so if you know where the cerebellar peduncles are and you know where the pons is, then you can pretty much figure out where the cerebellum is. In us, it's this big structure hanging out on either side, right? Okay. One of the things that we note about it is the cerebellum is made up of 2 major parts, the hemispheres and this part in the middle, this little middle part, which is called the vermis. As you saw, if you remember the sheep brain, the vermis actually seem much bigger and the hemispheres much smaller. That's because the hemispheres have just exploded in size in us. Now, if we cut down the middle of the cerebellum and therefore cut straight down the vermis, we can look at this beautiful structure here of white matter, fibers, and gray matter being all the brown stuff. And this structure, this pattern here is called the arbor vitae, or the tree of life, all right? So for us, we see it, we call it the arbor vitae. We know that we're seeing it because we've cut the vermis in half, and we know the vermis connects the 2 hemispheres of the cerebellum together. Ventricles, I need the ventricle model. I can show you some of them here, but